Good morning, MacLaren. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about John Lewis, a man who greatly respected Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and who fought for the justice of all people by living a life of redemptive suffering. Mr. Lewis was born on February 21st, 1940, to Eddie and Willie Mae Lewis. He grew up in Troy, Alabama, about 50 miles from Montgomery, on a sharecropping farm. As a child, he had to leave school during the harvest time to pick cotton, peanuts, and corn. It was also his responsibility to care for the chickens on the family farm, a responsibility he took very seriously. Lewis says he spent his days feeding the chickens, reading to them from the Bible, baptizing them when they were born, preaching to them for hours each day, finding inspiration in the words of a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr., who he listened to on the radio. Because of this and his childhood dream to become a minister, Lewis's family called him preacher. As a child, Lewis remembers, I saw the signs that said white men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. I would ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents, why? They would say, that's the way it is. Don't go getting in trouble. Lewis was obedient to his mother's wishes, but not for long. In 1957, Lewis wrote a letter to Martin Luther King Jr., who was then a young minister from Atlanta, who was just beginning to sow the seeds for what was going to become the civil rights movement. In his letter to Dr. King, Lewis stated that he wanted to attend Troy State College, but having never received a response from his application to Troy State, Lewis attended American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville. There he also worked as a dishwasher and a janitor to pay for his education. King eventually wrote back to Lewis, and in March of 1958, at the age of 18, Lewis met King for the first time at Montgomery's First Baptist Church. It was here that King nicknamed Lewis the boy from Troy. During this meeting, King told Lewis to have a discussion with his parents. If his parents were okay with it, King would help Lewis file a lawsuit against Troy State and the state of Alabama, an action that would likely lead to Lewis being admitted to the school, but that could cause his parents to lose their land, their house to be burned, or perhaps could even cost them their lives. Lewis's parents were too afraid, so he continued to study in Nashville. Back in Nashville, Lewis founded and became the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In the early days, he coordinated lunch counter sit-ins, an action that led to his first arrest. David Halberstam, a reporter from the Nashville Tennessean, described the sit-ins. The protests had been conducted with exceptional dignity, and gradually one image had come to prevail, that of elegant, courteous young Black people holding to their Gandhian principles, seeking the most elemental of rights while being assaulted by young white hoodlums who beat them up and on occasion extinguished cigarettes on their bodies. After 3 months of repeated and well-publicized sit-ins, Nashville became the first major Southern city to begin desegregating public facilities. Although Lewis' arrest was seen as a disgrace by his family, to him it was a badge of honor. Because of his actions, things were changing. He was getting into trouble, but it was a good trouble, the phrase that became his motto for life. Lewis graduated from seminary in 1961, but he remained in Nashville, where he led demonstrations against racially segregated restrooms, hotels, restaurants, public parks, and swimming pools. He was also among the original 13 Freedom Riders who challenged segregated interstate travel in the South. For his efforts, he was left beaten, bloody, and unconscious at a Greyhound bus station in Montgomery. Lewis later reflected that if there was anything I learned on that long, bloody bus trip of 1961, it was this: that we were in for a long, bloody fight here in the American South, and I intended to stay in the middle of it. Lewis did just that, and as a result, he was arrested 40 times between 1960 and 1966. Lewis helped organize the March on Washington in 1963, where he gave one of his first speeches at the Lincoln Memorial. Lewis later reflected on the March on Washington, remembering there being so much hope and optimism following the march. He said, "King inspired me. He lifted me. He was brave and courageous. And when you would listen to him speak or talk, you were ready to go out there and put your life on the line, because he made it so plain and clear that this was the right thing to do. He taught me to be hopeful, to be optimistic, to never get lost in despair, to never become bitter, and to never hate." In the mid-60s, in Selma, only 2.1% of African Americans were registered to vote. In order to register to vote, they had to pass the literacy test, which may have included things as absurd as guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar, knowing how many bubbles were in a bar of soap, or being asked to read the words on a blank page of paper and then being told what they had read wasn't right. Highly educated African American lawyers, doctors, and teachers were failing the test and were therefore denied the right to vote. To show the nation that people of color wanted to vote, Lewis helped lead the Voting Rights March in coordination with Jose Williams from Dr. King's organization. As he marched partway across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, police in riot gear used tear gas, bullwhips, rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire to beat the peaceful marchers. This march became known as Bloody Sunday and left Lewis in the hospital with a fractured skull. Images of his beating shocked the nation and helped lead the swift passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which extended voting rights to all citizens. Once registered, millions of African Americans began transforming politics across the South. Their voting power opened the door for Black people to run for public office. From 1986 to 2020, Lewis represented the area around Atlanta, Georgia, in Congress. He served 17 terms as a member of the House of Representatives. Looking back on his time in office, Lewis, who had been nicknamed the conscience of the Congress, reflected, "I have been in some kind of fight for freedom, equality, basic human rights for nearly my entire life. My philosophy is very simple. When you see something that's not right, not fair, not just, you have to stand up. You have to say something. You have to do something." I will now leave you with John Lewis's final essay, "Together, you can redeem the soul of our nation," words he requested be read on the day of his funeral last July.
I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people motivated simply by human compassion laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. That is why I had to visit Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, though I was admitted to the hospital the following day. I just had to see and feel it for myself, that after many years of silent witness, the truth is still marching on. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at the time. I will never, ever forget the moment when it became so clear that he could easily have been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Though I was surrounded by two loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, Unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwitting concert goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McLean. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, speak up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe, because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide.